Greetings and welcome to another lecture in psychopathology. We're continuing on with the humanistic therapies from where we left off in the prior video, talking about Gestalt therapy. Now, Gestalt is kind of interesting because it originally wasn't really a humanistic therapy. It was kind of a proto-humanistic in a way that it existed probably a couple of decades before the humanistic therapies did. But the Gestalt basically, it's named exactly what it is, but it's named in German. Gestalt therapy is usually summed up as a view that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that we need to look at the big picture rather than the picky details. And in a way, Gestalt therapy also follows along with that, in that it gets people basically to know more about themselves, to see more about themselves, and to accept these things about themselves. In that way, it's very much like humanistic therapies, in that it's about understanding yourself better and accepting yourself both good and bad. Gestalt therapy isn't done very often. It's probably best known for something called chair therapy. And the idea behind chair therapy is that there is an empty chair in the room, and the person talks as if there is actually someone in the chair. Clint Eastwood did a version of this. It wasn't chair therapy, but he was talking to a chair back, I believe, in the 2012 election cycle, and got a lot of crap for it. He pretended he was talking to Obama, that Obama was saying all sorts of things that only Clint could hear. But at any rate, here we go in terms of chair therapy, in terms of Gestalt therapy. So they talk to the person, they yell at the person with the idea that they can work through their relationship with that person. And by working through their relationship, maybe they're talking to someone who always put them down or said bad things about them. And it might allow them, therefore, to work through that and be able to think better of themselves, if maybe not think better of the other person. I don't have a lot of detail on Gestalt therapy because, quite frankly, it's not done very often. Even in terms of some of the rarer psychotherapies. And not to mention that Gestalt therapy has the same problems as all the humanistic therapies do, even the ones we talked about in the prior video, the client-centered therapy, and it has one big problem, which is it's not backed up by evidence. Mostly because this type of therapy, in terms of what it is supposed to do, the results are very, very vague. It's easier to measure a reduction of symptoms than it is to measure whether somebody likes themselves a little bit more. So it's difficult to test, although people are trying now. There are studies going on now trying to go through and test these things and figure out if there indeed is a way that we can see if this is doing what its proponents claim that it does. And like I said, that's for all the humanistic therapies, not just Gestalt. From the humanistic therapies, we move on to actually the therapy that the humanistic therapies were formed to rebel against, psychodynamic theories and psychoanalytic theories. Now, the oldie but a goodie in this case, and the one that people tend to think of when they think of psychodynamic theories, is classic Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, Freud was a very interesting guy. He had a lot of groundbreaking ideas, and he had a lot of ideas that were just wrong. They were either wrong or they couldn't be tested and may never be tested. And when we're talking evidence-based, this is a problem. Because, of course, we don't really have evidence for this other than the fact that people say it works. And in the first video of this chapter, we talked about how much that is worth, which is not a whole lot. But it involves free association, the idea being that our problems come from, among other things, our unconscious, which is a part of the mind that we by definition cannot access. And the idea is that by free association, by talking about the first things that come into our head, we may indeed be able to come up with what is bothering us, as long as we don't think about what we're saying. There's dream analysis, where we have the manifest content of what we actually dream, and then we have the latent content of what the dreams mean. And the idea is that it is through dreams that we can see what's going on in the unconscious, although even then they're masked, and that's why we need to do analysis of the dreams instead of just the dreams themselves. We have resistance, which is when a person in some way doesn't want to go with the program of the therapy. They're late, they don't show up, they don't do what they're asked to do. And the idea is that they are resisting because you're getting a little close to the scary stuff that they have buried in the unconscious, and therefore you need to get through this resistance, go do an end run around it maybe through free association in order to be able to get to the really good stuff that they are hiding. And then we have transference, where the therapist starts to play the role of an important person in the client's life, and the client begins to transfer the feelings for that person toward the therapist, allowing the therapist to, at least in theory, react in such a way to allow the client to work their way through these feelings. I don't have time to even scratch the surface of Freudian psychoanalysis. I mean, there could be whole years taught on this. People study this for years and years and years. But this is kind of the basics. It gives you an idea. Again, if you remember, you probably covered this back in general psychology to a greater or lesser extent. Nowadays, classic psychoanalysis pretty much is non-existent. And it's non-existent for a couple of reasons, including the fact that it takes a very long time, and that it's very, very expensive, and that it doesn't work for serious things like schizophrenia. It tends to work for things like people feel mildly bad about themselves. It has a lot of downsides to it, not to mention, of course, the giant downside in that it's something that cannot be tested. Because for the most part, it's based on things like the unconscious that you cannot, by definition, access. It's the unconscious. It's a part of the mind we cannot access. In fact, we don't even have any real proof that we have an unconscious. And if we don't have an unconscious, then all of Freud's theories more or less collapse like a house of cards. And if we do have an unconscious, what's in it? Well, again, if Freud's ideas of what's in it, the id, ego, and superego cage match, are incorrect, then again, house of cards. So for the most part, psychoanalysis exists today in terms of its newer type called psychodynamic theory. Now, psychodynamic theory takes at least some of Freud's ideas and runs with them. Some of the ideas that seem to be the most useful, that seem to be the most grounded in reality in some cases. It's much more directive. Psychoanalysis was always kind of directive. Freud did not want anyone else to be in charge. He wanted to be in charge. So in that way, it was directive. But this is perhaps even more so and more challenging. It's actually got some aspects of cognitive behavior therapy in there, and that people are challenged about their viewpoints, about their beliefs, about themselves, and about their relationships with others. Psychodynamic theory is less about delving into the depths of your unconscious and more about why you behave toward others and with others the way that you do, why that might be good or bad, and how you might be able to change it. So it's changed quite a bit. Freud, I'm sure, would disown it if he were still alive. And but it may indeed be more useful than classic psychoanalysis. In terms of whether or not it works, what its efficacy is, classic psychoanalysis has not really been tested. Because, as I've mentioned several times in just this video, some of it's virtually impossible to test. Now, psychodynamic theory does tend to show promise to treating some disorders. Some people who have these disorders is probably a better way of putting it. Treating some cases of depression. And again, we know that depression can have to do with interpersonal relationships, so that might be it. Post-traumatic stress disorder. This would kind of make sense because if we do have an unconscious, a lot of people with PTSD have maybe trying not to think about that traumatic event or trying to bury it, yet it comes through. Substance abuse, again, it might be instead of you're focusing on a relationship with a person, it's focusing on a relationship with a drug. And borderline personality disorder, interestingly enough. The personality disorders, as you probably have learned, are fairly resistant to therapy. But borderline personality disorder seems to respond, at least in some cases, to psychodynamic theory. So there may indeed be some benefit to it, at least in certain cases. And thus we reach the end of the talk therapies and the behavior therapies. And in the next videos, we will talk about the biological therapies.